Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Randy Welsh with the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. Coming to you with our ongoing series of wilderness challenges, wilderness issues affecting the National Wilderness System and our wilderness stewardship groups. With me today is Dave Cantrell, our programs chair, who is responsible for pulling these webinars together, and our two presenters, who you can see there, Rachel Green and Lisa Gerloff. I'll be introducing them again in more detail in a minute. Our subject today is to look at public lands and climate change. This is a lead-in to our Effects of Climate Change workshop, which is the theme of the National Wilderness Workshop coming up in October. We hope that you have had a chance to look that workshop over and have signed up for the virtual offerings that will be October 9th through the 16th. We've had to make that change because of the COVID crisis. Instead of being face-to-face, we're going to spend time virtually with each other and studying the effects of climate change on the National Wilderness System. And today's webinar is sort of a precursor of that, to sort of entice you to come and get more, and also to share some good work that's happening with our stewardship groups in the U.S. right now around climate change and studying the effects, sharing, educating people about those effects, and trying to better understand what those effects are in their particular wilderness areas. You know, climate change is in the news today. If you don't have to go far to look, we have massive wildfires throughout the West this year, caused by the warming temperatures from climate change. We have hurricanes that are bombarding the southern coast of the U.S. right as we speak, again from warming oceans and the effect that warming ocean has on weather patterns. We have raising sea levels, ocean levels. Just an article yesterday talked about how one of the great Antarctic ice sheets is at risk of dropping into the ocean, which could raise sea levels by 10 feet. So these are dramatic effects, very dramatic, and they are in the news every day. And we're just been told that our temperatures for the last year are the hottest on record, and the last 5 years have been the hottest decade on record. So something is happening, and we need to know about it, and we need to take some action about it. Well, today we have two different examples of how you can take action in your own local area to deal with the effects of climate change. Rachel Green, who is the Climate Education and Stewardship Program Manager with the Great Old Broads for Wilderness, is going to discuss the Broads grant funding program that empowers volunteers to educate their communities about the intersecting issues of climate change and public lands management. They have a whole host of hands-on learning, online engagement, and other inspiring stewardship opportunities that center on nature-based climate solutions that she will share with us. I think that's going to be real fascinating, and lots of opportunities for stewardship groups to find program ideas and other techniques that can be successful in your own local area. And then Lisa Gerloff with the University of Montana Wilderness Institute will discuss their citizen science program and how they are using volunteers to collect climate change indicator information in wilderness areas around Montana, other parts of the state. And I think you'll find it very fascinating and interesting to see how volunteers can be successfully used to collect all sorts of information that can be very useful to know more about your own particular area, but add to the knowledge that we all need to better manage the wilderness system as a whole, and that can add to the knowledge base about climate change and climate-induced effects. So what I would like you to think about as we listen to these two presenters is how can your wilderness stewardship program benefit by adapting or trying some of these techniques and some of these tools? And then how can collecting data from your local area be used to support science-based decision-making in your local area? So with that, I'd like to turn the time over to Rachel Green, who will do our first presentation, and then we'll have Lisa following. At the end of the presentations, we'll have open time for questions and some dialogue with our presenters. As we go along, if you do think of questions that you would like to ask, just please use the question function on your screen. Just type in that question. We'll collect those and have them ready to be asked and answered following the presentations. So let's go ahead and turn it over to you, Rachel.
All right.
All right, it's all yours.
There we go. All right, thanks, Randy. Once again, my name is Rachel Green. I manage the Climate Education and Stewardship Program with Great Old Broads for Wilderness. And today I'm excited to share with you a little bit about our organization for those of you who aren't familiar with Great Old Broads, and talk about this exciting new program that we launched in November of 2019, and talk a little bit about how we're bringing these connections to life of climate change and public lands health, and a bit about how we're adapting to the context of a pandemic and how that's been shaping the resources that we've developed over the last year. So for those of you who might not be familiar with Great Old Broads for Wilderness, our mission is to engage and inspire action in order to preserve and protect wilderness and wild lands. And we've been around since 1989. Our founders realized that there were voices missing from the public lands conversation, particularly the voices of older women. And these folks are impassioned, they're experienced, and they're certainly not afraid to speak out on behalf of these critical landscapes. And I would even argue that we really need these voices of Great Old Broads more so than ever before, with what we're seeing happening on our public lands, especially on a federal level. But really, we think of broadness as a state of mind. So anyone and everyone is welcome to join the Great Old Broads community, regardless of age, gender, or background. Our organization, like so many others across the country, is engaging in some challenging conversations to really think deeply about the work that we do and our own community in terms of how we can more effectively foster a sense of equity, justice, racial justice, and inclusion, not only in the work that we do around public lands, but our communities in general. So Broads have been doing some pretty incredible work over the last 30 years. We have grown to over 40 chapters across the country that we call broadbands, spanning across 16 states from coast to coast. We engage over 8,000 members across the country and now have 10 full-time staff members at our national office here in Durango, Colorado. What we do is a combination of education, advocacy, and stewardship work, and a big part of what drives the work that we do is the variety of passions and experience and on-the-ground knowledge that our volunteers bring to this work. And that was a big guiding principle to the formation of the Climate Education and Stewardship Program, is really thinking about all of those diverse expertise and passions that our volunteers bring to our organization. So Great Old Broads has 3 focus areas to our work. The first is keeping wildlands wild and the Wilderness Act intact so that these incredible landscapes retain their magnificent characteristics for future generations. And the second is keeping public lands in public hands, which is where we really think about issues of federal land transfer to states, special interest groups, and industry sell-off of public lands, which is, a more pressing issue than ever for our federal lands, especially. And our third focus area is making public lands part of the solution to climate change, which is really where our Climate Education and Stewardship Program comes in. So this program was formed in November of 2019, thanks to an incredibly generous one-time opportunity grant from an anonymous foundation that really allowed us to think creatively and strategically about an area of our work that we really wanted to deepen and expand. And we chose climate change as the topic that we really wanted to engage more deeply with and empower our volunteers to feel confident in drawing these connections between climate change and public lands. So to get into the specifics of what this program looks like, one of the stipulations of the grant that we received was taking a regional focus. So we decided to pilot the first year of this program in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, the Northwest region. And in terms of who's involved with this program, the approach that we took was really focusing on empowering our grassroots leaders and broadband members to build their skills and confidence as facilitators, educators, stewardship project collaborators who can not only reach out to their chapter members, but reach beyond our own community to a general public audience to form creative partnerships across their community. And how we're going about this program is primarily by hosting and planning place-based education and stewardship events that are dynamic and collaborative and inclusive. And all the while, we're supporting these programs by developing a toolkit of educational and planning resources so that our volunteers can bring these topics to life. And part of how we've done this is breaking down these topics into different modules. So one is Climate and Public Lands 101. And then the others are focused on, ecological themes, forests, rivers, and coastal systems. And I'll get into those in a little bit more detail in a minute. So I wanted to briefly cover what the goals of this climate education and stewardship program are. The first being increasing the public understanding of the connections between public lands and climate change, which don't necessarily have an obvious connection for a lot of folks. And a big part of how we're showing people this connection is by illustrating the connection between intact ecosystems and their abilities to safeguard communities, livelihoods, cultures, endangered species that we cherish from the impacts of climate change. Our second goal as a program is to inspire communities to champion nature-based climate solutions. And this really looks like restoration and stewardship projects on the ground that
It looks like we may have lost Rachel.
down for a minute.
I mean, like there's nothing happening.
Can folks hear me okay?
I've got you back, Rachel. Sorry, somehow we lost you for a minute.
Oh, that's right. I think my internet went out for a second. Sorry about that.
Rachel, you might want to go back like 30 seconds.
Okay. Did you all hear the first program goal?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
You were in the second one.
Okay, I'll start from that second one. Sorry about that. So the second goal of our program here is focused on inspiring communities to champion nature-based climate solutions. So the way that we're thinking about this is carrying out on-the-ground stewardship and restoration projects that really highlight and emphasize climate resilience. So whether that's carbon sequestration, improving ecological functions, connectivity, gathering data to steer future management decisions that could enhance climate resilience, really highlighting these themes as the central objective of our stewardship project. And all the while as we're planning these stewardship projects, we're thinking about how we can emphasize and really include the frontline communities who are disproportionately feeling the impacts of climate change. So we're intentionally partnering with frontline marginalized communities, whether that be Indigenous communities or young women, students, educators, all of whom we're reaching out to and partnering with through our volunteer networks. And the final goal of this program is thinking about how we can create a path for deepened engagement for not only our own volunteers, but the public in general. So through these dynamic in education and hands-on stewardship projects, we can get people passionate about these topics and improve or enhance their sense of ownership so that they can find their own voice and feel a drive to advocate for the places that they care about. So as I mentioned, we have 4 different curriculum areas, these different modules with tools and resources for our volunteers to use on the ground. And each of these different modules not only talks about the climate impacts that we can expect in these different landscapes, but also the layered threats that public lands are facing, whether that be logging, overgrazing, water use, etc., and thinking about how, on the flip side, these ecosystems are so critical to our collective climate resilience. So just to give you an example from each of these 4 modules, in the Climate Public Lands 101 module, we talk about, for instance, the fact that 25% of US carbon emissions come from the oil, gas, and coal that's extracted from public lands. So the management choices that we make on these landscapes has a really significant role to play in conversations about climate mitigation and adaptation. In the forest module, we talk a lot about carbon sequestration. So for instance, certain Northwest forests sequester more carbon per acre than the Amazon rainforest. And yet, these areas are vulnerable to logging, and we've seen some incredible reductions in the natural carbon sequestration in the Northwest. For instance, Washington State's natural, forest-based carbon sequestration has been reduced by 34% due to logging. In Oregon, that number is high as 46%. In the rivers module, we're talking, for instance, about how our watersheds, our water systems have changed as we've seen these landscapes become more industrialized. So, for instance, in the Puget Sound River system alone, we've lost a lot of the deep, cool pools that we would normally see in more diverse river systems. So by restoring, woody debris, dead trees, beaver dams to these watersheds, we can actually restore critical habitat for endangered salmon species so that they can withstand increasingly high river temperatures in these cooler refugia or pools. And finally, as an example, in the coastal module, we talk a lot about blue carbon. This is, the deep pool of carbon that's stored in these water-saturated soils in coastal estuaries that in some instances can sequester 10 times the carbon compared to inland forests, which absolutely is incredible. And all the while, these coastal ecosystems can also shelter coastal communities and cities from more extreme weather events. So that's just a taste of the types of themes that we're bringing up in these different curriculum areas, and not only asking folks to think about local, tangible climate impacts, but also the critical role of intact ecosystems as we navigate a changing climate and our collective climate resilience. So each of these curriculum modules has a PowerPoint presentation and a script to help our volunteers navigate these different themes and really feel confident that what they're explaining is backed up by data and they can dive deeper into those resources if they're really passionate about any of these themes. We've developed some hands-on activities and exercises that go with these different modules, as well as stewardship and ecological restoration support materials. So resources to help our volunteers navigate the planning process and think strategically about their partnerships and how they can really make these projects make clear climate connections and be as inclusive as possible. And finally, these talking points in each of these different modules essentially takes those golden nuggets of information and distills them down into just a couple pages of really compelling points that a volunteer can print out, throw in their backpack, and feel comfortable, making these connections for the members of their community when they're out on trail. So back in May of 2020, we had planned on traveling up to Washington State to host a training for our Northwest leaders and bring these topics into the real world. And unfortunately, due to COVID, we had to move this training online. But we were all really pleasantly surprised by how well this training went. People were incredibly engaged, and we had 3 half-day Zoom sessions really digging into topics of strong facilitation techniques, how we can be compelling, engaging educators, thinking through these different resources and activity ideas, and then starting to get into the planning process for how we can bring these events to life in the future. And at this point, we're planning on hosting another training with our Northwest leaders to introduce the last 2 modules, the rivers and coast resources. And then we're thinking towards 2021 about hosting partner trainings where we can reach out to other organizations who might be interested in bringing some of these resources into their stewardship or climate-related work. So finally, I wanted to offer a couple examples of what these customized approaches have looked like for our different broadband chapters. This was a big part of our mindset going into the training and developing these resources, is making sure there's a lot of room for adaptation and creativity for our volunteers to have a lot of fun with this. So the first example I wanted to share is from the Chehalis River in Washington State. We have 3 chapters in Washington who partnered together to bring their climate education and stewardship work to life. And they have been partnering with all sorts of nonprofits, public agencies, the Chehalis tribe, to bring together this 4-part online speaker series over the course of the fall, all focused around the themes of watershed health, climate impacts, and nature-based climate resilience. And in November, they're going to be hosting a 3-day stewardship project, thinking about pulling invasive species, planting native species, and while socially distancing in really small groups, exploring that riparian ecosystem and looking and exploring the climate solutions and threats that they're seeing on the landscape. So this was a great example of bringing to life the Rivers and Climate module. And meanwhile, a little further south in the Willamette Valley, our broadband here is partnering with Cascadia Wildlands to become certified in forest monitoring on Forest Service lands. And I can't overstate the value of these types of monitoring projects, because we're filling that critical data gap for public land management agencies through our volunteer efforts. And these folks are planning to, when it's appropriate and safe, bring out partner members of their community to help them with these monitoring project days, while pulling educational resources from our forest module so that they can really deepen and bring to life the connections between, biodiversity, climate impacts, and public lands management choices. So we're incredibly excited to see these projects starting to come to life. And the last example that I wanted to offer you all is one piece of curriculum that we're developing right now, and we're going to have a training with our volunteers at the end of the month. We partnered up with Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council, who has been conducting some online trainings around the mobile app, EdMaps, which you can download on your smartphone and allows you to tag the location of invasive species out on public lands. So we've been working with this partner organization to craft some resources that are tailored to our community. We put together a presentation that really explores the connections between invasive species and climate change. And we're thinking that this regional project could have some pretty valuable benefits, not only in the context of a pandemic, when we can really focus on these projects that are a bit more nimble and self-guided so that we can do this while socially distancing, but also when we think about the devastating wildfires that are taking place throughout the Northwest, we have to think forward to the wildfire recovery process that's going to be taking place after the fact. And this often also means that there's an opportunity for greater invasive species invasion. So this early monitoring and reporting could be a really critical role that our volunteers can play in that recovery process. So we're excited to share this resource in about a month with our Northwest leaders. And to wrap up, we're excited to continue training not only our broadband leaders, but thinking towards how we can partner with other organizations to get these resources out there, and continuing to think about what type of creative programs and events we can put on while responsibly distancing amid the pandemic. And we have 2 events that we're looking forward to in 2021, one in Washington State and one in Maine, that are really going to highlight these climate change and public lands connections. We call these broad walks. They're multi-day events with hikes, stewardship projects, speaker panels where you can really dig into these topics in more detail. So feel free to visit our website if you're interested in that. And just around the corner on October 15th, we have a documentary screening coming up, Beaver Believers, which is a really fun story that really explores some of these connections between ecological restoration, nature-based climate resilience, and some of the challenges that we're facing with implementing these kinds of projects. So I hope you'll join us for that. All the registration info is on our website. And with that, please feel free to reach out if you have any more questions about the Climate Education and Stewardship Program. You can email me or Lauren, our Associate Director, for more information. But I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a bit about this and look forward to seeing what kind of questions folks have. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Hang on, stay around as we have questions later, but I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Lisa. There she is. So can you go ahead and activate your screen, Lisa?
Getting there.
Okay. Great. Time is yours.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Randy, for having me back. Today, I'm going to be talking about how to harness the enthusiasm of volunteers to monitor for wilderness character and wilderness study areas in Montana. And I'll be using the term wilderness character a lot. But measuring impacts to wilderness character often, are indicators of climate change as well. So the Citizen Science Program has been part of the Wilderness Institute at the University of Montana for quite a while now, since 2005. Initially, well, the goal of the program is to get on the ground monitoring done and engage citizens in that process. Initially, we began by doing campsite inventories and weed inventories for the Forest Service. In 2009, though, we worked with Peter Landrus from the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute and managers from Region 1 here of the Forest Service to develop a field measures protocol for monitoring wilderness character. And we've been using volunteers in that process. In all the projects that we do with wilderness character monitoring are partnership projects. So we are engaging with a federal agency or doing a project at the request of a federal agency, whether that's the Forest Service or the BLM. And we're often working with other NGOs that are either helping us recruit volunteers or giving us information on the area that we're working. So under the 5 qualities of wilderness character, untrammeled, natural, undeveloped, opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation, or other features of values. These are the field observations that we are making to measure wilderness character. So we're looking at everything from, are there invasive plants on the landscape? Is there livestock use allowed? And if so, what are their impacts from that use? What are the installations and developments on the landscape? What are the recreation impacts? Are there evidence of motorized or mechanized use? Are there cultural resources on the landscape? So I'm going to show you a little detail of our protocol in just a minute, which will show you that our protocol is very robust. And so we don't take our protocol and just hand it over to our volunteers. Our volunteers go out with trained field leaders. But our volunteers certainly add more eyes and ears on the ground for us to capture all this information. So we're looking at, as I said, everything from invasive weeds to cultural resources. And the type of information we're taking for weeds is, what type of weed species is it? How big is the infestation? What is the cover? What's the spatial distribution? What are the disturbances? Why is that weed there? And what is the ecosystem type like? We also look at tree cover, dominant understory species, tree structure, distance from water. We're looking at wildlife encounters, especially key species that the agency might be interested in. We're doing, pika inventory, and any information on pikas that we gather, which are a indicator species for climate change, we share with the Craighead Institute. They have a very extensive database on pika distribution. We're looking at installation and developments. What structures are on the landscape and who made them? Are they agency created or are they user created? And what type of condition are they in? The same with signs. Who created them? What condition? Looking at campsites. Are campsites naturalized or are they highly impacted? And we're looking at encounters with people, trying to get a sense of the visitor experience. So when you're walking out there, excuse me. When you're out in the wilderness, what is your experience of solitude? So how many other people are you seeing on the trail or in the campsite? And who are they? Are they a day hiker, a backpacker, or do we have stock use? And we're also looking for evidence of motorized or mechanized use. We don't want that to happen in wilderness and wilderness study areas. So, in the top photo, we have some mountain bike tracks and some four-wheeling tracks below. These two photos are in wilderness study areas. And is there evidence of social trails and who made them? Or what is their use? Foot use, motorbike, bicycle, livestock? Are they making use of an old route or is it a new route? So the top photo here is a trail that's, can definitely is being seen, or you can definitely see it's being used by mountain bikes. The lower photo, this is a social trail up to a climbing area in the Humbug Spires Wilderness Study Area. And is there cultural resources on the landscape? Are they historic, prehistoric, paleo? And if they're historic, what type of condition are they in? So the photos we have, you know, trilobite, an old cabin site, and a culturally scarred tree. So that's just a little snapshot of some of the information that we're gathering when we do wilderness character monitoring with our volunteers. So we collect that data that's brought back to the office, where we package that information in a database and into maps and a summary report, and that's provided to whatever agency we're working with, whether it's the Forest Service or the BLM, and that information is also shared on our website, so it's available to the public. And we're doing this with citizen volunteers. As I mentioned, our volunteers are not going out on their own. They're going out with our trained field leaders. So the type of folks that we capture are folks that want a guided experience, but they certainly, as I pointed out, add extra ears and eyes on the ground, because our protocol is robust and it's a lot of information to gather at once. So for example, if folks are taking a weed point, you get super focused on the data that you're collecting. It's nice to have other people around to go, hey, I hear an airplane. Well, that would trigger a noise point. So having enough people out on the ground, we're going to capture everything we need to for wilderness character monitoring. So if we want to look at the makeup of our volunteers for the Wilderness Institute, we've been around long enough, so we have a high returning rate, and kind of the, if you wanted to think of kind of our volunteers in a geographic pie, over half the pie would be volunteers from Missoula. A good chunk piece would be volunteers from Montana, and then the smallest slice would be volunteers from other states. But we do get a fair amount of volunteers from all over the country, from Washington, Oregon, Michigan, New York City, Washington, D.C., North Carolina. So we do draw folks in from quite a range. Most, and maybe I would assume other stewardship groups might experience this as well. Our volunteers tend to be college age or 55 and older. Those are the folks we're capturing mostly. Sometimes we get some outliers, such as this young 10-year-old in the middle photo, who was one of our most engaged volunteers ever, and one of the favorite of my field leaders. So I already, going the wrong direction, sorry. This is a slide I pulled from a presentation I gave specifically on our project with the BLM, but the bolded statements really apply to any federal agency that is managing wilderness. And that is the benefits of wilderness character monitoring to resource management is standardizing a wilderness monitoring program across a single agency, but hopefully across all the agencies, to develop partnerships. You know, monitoring takes funds and people, and we can't do it alone. So we need to share the assessment, the inventory, the monitoring tasks to make sure that it gets done. And it's an opportunity to recruit, train, and mentor young people. A number of folks, young folks that work for me as field leaders have gone on to work with the agencies. And it's a great way to build partnerships with institutions such as the University of Montana. And really, I'll just emphasize, you know, any work that we're going to get done on wilderness character monitoring, climate change monitoring, education, the education that Rachel spoke of earlier, we're going to get that done through partnerships. And kind of rush through that, but I'm really kind of interested in the questions that you have. So I will end it there.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Let me pull it back and have all our presenters come forward. And there we go. All right, so now's the time for our attendees in the audience to be typing in your questions into the question dialog boxes, and we'll queue those up between Dave and I for our presenters. So I have a couple of questions that come to my mind while people are doing that. So Rachel, with your programs, who can participate in your programs? Do they have to be Great Old Broad members? And how do you sign up for some of the sessions?
Good question. So I think a big variable there is whether it is a national event or a regional event. So the broad walks, for instance, that I talked about that are happening in Washington and Maine in 2021 are national events. So that's something that anyone from anywhere in the country can sign up for. They just need to go through the process of becoming a member of our organization to join us for one of those. But for local events, especially those that are organized through the Climate Education and Stewardship program, are all really public facing. So we're focusing on recruiting, local community members to join us for those, especially, the kind of projects I talked about in Washington and Oregon. We're focusing on ways that our volunteers can really be the leaders of those events and bring in new members of the community, outside of active broadband members.
Okay. Lisa, we have a question for you about in the data recording that you do, are you using any particular apps for recording your data on different applications of wilderness character?
Up until this year, we've been using Trimble units to collect the data. This year, we've just piloted using iPads, using Survey 123 to collect the data, and that appears to have worked really, really well for us. And that's probably what we'll use going forward.
Okay, and another question for you, Lisa, is how can wilderness stewardship groups in Montana partner with the Wilderness Institute on these citizen science field trips?
Well, the Wilderness Institute is kind of in a unique place in that we're not tied to one wilderness area or wilderness study area, so we tend to move around from season to season. If you have a stewardship group in the area where we're working, so for example, we worked for a number of years in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, and I worked very closely with that wilderness, the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness Foundation, and they helped us do a lot of outreach to their volunteers for our monitoring trips. Yeah, so I would just say if you're a stewardship group and you're interested in doing wilderness character monitoring, let me know who you are and where you're located. And if where we're working is in your area, I would certainly contact you.
Okay, and is the Wilderness Institute capable of going to other states nearby, like in Idaho? Or are you limited to the state of Montana?
We're certainly not limited to Montana, and I would definitely say we've done a little work in Idaho as part of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness and the Frank Church Wilderness. We've done a little work in the Gospel Hump. So I would say if you're within a day's driving for us in Missoula, we'd definitely be willing to work with you.
Okay, great. Another question for Rachel. So if someone outside of the Old Broads wants to access this curriculum or wants to request a training or presentation, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So they really have two options. One is reaching out to us at the national office, especially if you're outside of the Northwest region, then, either emailing me, Rachel@greatoldbroads.org, or Lauren@greatoldbroads.org would be a great way to get the conversation going. If you're in the Northwest region, what you can also do is go to our website, and we have a directory of the location of each of our different local chapters. So if you're interested in reaching out directly to one of our volunteer networks who are putting these different, presentations and events together and partner with them directly, that's another option.
Rachel, a related question. You mentioned partnering with communities and with organizations to facilitate on-the-ground projects. What are the criteria for that? How would someone bring forward a suggestion?
Yeah, I think that the sky's the limit in terms of, creative connections between climate change and public lands. So there are, so many varieties, the type of partnerships that we can be thinking about, but the way that we've really categorized it for our volunteers to think about, strategic partnership outreach is stewardship and, technical partners who might bring, for instance, solitude monitoring experience or habitat restoration knowledge, where they can, enhance our technical expertise and capacity to bring, the science to these projects. And then we're also thinking about community groups. So that might have more of an equity focus or just more of a creative partnership with folks who may have less of a relationship with public lands, but could be really interested in the topics that we're bringing up or thinking about our collective climate resilience. So we want our volunteers to really be juggling both and, kind of balancing them evenly so that we're making sure we're bringing new folks into the conversation, but also being sure that the projects that we're investing our time and energy into are going to have substantial impacts when it comes to enhancing climate resilience. So we're seeing all sorts of kind of creative combinations happening with our volunteer chapters in the Northwest, depending on, what their local passions are. So seeing that, for instance, the Washington Broadband is focusing not only on working with local watershed groups, but also with the Chehalis tribe to invite representatives from the tribal government for a panel discussion on a webinar, and also inviting tribal members to participate and co-facilitate a stewardship project. I've been really impressed with the way that they're kind of balancing all of those different voices.
Here's a question for both of our presenters, and feel free to answer it however you want. But what's been your experience in working with local citizen groups and their acceptance and ability, or their acceptance of climate change, and what you think their acceptance or ability to influence and build some sort of climate change resilience into the system? So their acceptance of climate change information, and then their interest in ability to try to bring about some climate change resilience and changing the character of our systems and our organizations. What have you seen in the groups and the individuals that you've talked with?
Yeah, so what I've heard, at least from our Northwest leaders, when we chat about this kind of topic, I think there's a gap oftentimes between people's concern about climate change and their sense of efficacy. So I've learned a lot looking at the Yale Climate Group and the long-standing research that they've been doing, the same survey year in, year in, year, about the distribution of people's perception of climate change from being alarmed or concerned to the opposite end of being doubtful or dismissive of climate as an issue. And every time I bring that study up to folks, they're really surprised that over 50% of Americans fall in the alarmed or concerned group. So a lot of people, are already accepting this science, but there can be a huge gap between their understanding that it's happening and their willingness to actually have a conversation about it or do something about it or, get involved with solutions. So I've found that a lot of folks are kind of stuck in that middle space, and the more we can inspire folks and get them on the ground with these tangible types of opportunities for engagement, that seems to be, the spark that a lot of people are missing right now.
I would agree with Rachel. The key is getting folks on the ground and inspiring them to start having the conversation. Most of the volunteers that we work are, I would say, individual volunteers. They're not a part of another type of advocacy group or conservation group, so they might not have really been thinking of how all this works of use on the landscape and how that's impacting our resources and impacting climate. So I would say that that's one of the nice things about having our volunteers going out with our trained leaders is they're learning the skills of how to monitor for these indicators, but they're also having conversations while they're eating dinner at nights. So they're starting to talk about, okay, here's the impacts. What's the Forest Service or the BLM doing to manage this, and what do I think they should be doing? So it's getting them to start thinking about it.
All right. Dave, any other questions?
Coming off that one, if you are a local stewardship group, it's hard for me to imagine, and with my local group here in the northern end of the Colorado Front Range, what do we do? What changes for us? How are we to act in light of climate change information and get out and do the same patrols, the same things that we've always done in this new atmosphere? I find I don't know how to think about that.
I know, at least in the context of Great Old Broads, that's sort of that trajectory from education and stewardship into advocacy that we're always talking about is, is there a thread that we can follow from, for instance, the forest monitoring project that I mentioned? If that same plot of land that's managed by the Forest Service might be up for logging potentially in the future, that's an opportunity, to circle back to those same volunteers and deepen their engagement to act on, that tangible place that they've built a connection with, and scale up to understanding how they can be a part of, having a lever of influence on those types of management decisions. And that's where, the other sphere of our organization can come in, where we start thinking about grassroots organizing and what types of actions we can take to empower citizens to be more engaged pieces of that equation, and have an impact, a tangible impact on whether public lands really are able to be a part of the climate change solution.
That's interesting. That's a thread we're going to tug on next year, and our National Wilderness Workshop will have some. Next year we'll have some thoughts about advocacy for stewardship, or towards stewardship. So great. So I think we've exhausted the questions that have come from the audience, and so I think our time is just about up as well. So I'm going to go ahead and thank Rachel and Lisa for your outstanding presentations today and sharing with us the work that the Great Old Broads are doing and that the Wilderness Institute is doing around Montana. Thank you for that. And again, for our audience, this presentation is recorded and will be posted on our NWSA website probably by the end of the week. So feel free to come back and view it or share it with those that might have missed it today and will gain some value from it. Again, our upcoming next event is the National Wilderness Workshop, which this year will be virtual through a series of webinar portals and webinar events, October 9th through the 16th. You can find out more information about the National Wilderness Workshop on our NWSA website or through the Society of Wilderness Stewardship website. It's their turn to host, and so they're handling most of the arrangements this year. But we're excited to be looking at some more of the ecological change happening around us, how we can address it, how people can be more engaged and involved in learning about climate change and then actually doing something about it. So again, thank you everybody for participating in today's webinar, and hope everybody is able to enjoy the rest of their day. I know we're going to be hunkering down because we're full of smoke right now from fires in Oregon. Again, one of those effects of climate change and the massive wildfires that are hitting the West. But hope everybody else is able to breathe easy and take care with all you're doing. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, you. Thanks, guys.
And presenters, please just stay on the line.